So welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and to another battle actually that is from my rather extensive backlog, because I have a very limited amount of time to record today. So I'm going to be doing a battle from the RP series, which I was sent by Kuro-chan about a month or so ago at this point, and it is once again going to be Arable, this time facing off against Khan, and it's going to be an interesting little matchup. Obviously I've made my feelings on Arable and how relatively easy they are to play quite clear, and you can see from their rather interesting tactical geometry that they've got going on here, they're going to be playing in a very predictable way for the Dwarves today. So I'm afraid I won't be able to remain impartial for this battle. I will be rooting for Khan all the way, unfortunately, for the Arable team, played by Captain Gervais and Frodo. And this is a map called the Old Forest Road, and you may have already noticed one of the glitches which can happen is some of the sections of trees can sometimes pop in and out, which is rather interesting. But this is a map that doesn't have any crashing issues, I know for me. That's only some of the newer maps with a lot of different assets on it. This map is going to be just fine. So seeing as we're over here already, let's have a look at the Dwarves. And like I've said about the Dwarves of Arable, they are a very comfortable faction to play. You can very much pitch your tent with them. They can be aggressive, to be fair, but you'll rarely see Arable feel the need to do that, because they can just stand in formation, let their crossbows do a lot of the dirty work, and then their pretty damn good infantry can polish off whatever's left, and then they can also defend their flanks with their cavalry, and of course their crossbows can do the work of also holding down the flanks as well. So it's a very easy way to play the game, I would say. But there's nothing wrong with doing it. It is how Arable are set up, and it is their focus after all, so it does make sense that they are rather good at it. The thing that really sends them over the top in terms of being a little bit too powerful, in my opinion, is the Black Book Engineers. They kind of make the difference to the point where this kind of playstyle would be alright if not for the fact that when you do engage with Arable, all they then need to do is put their Blacklocks around the flank, and then your whole army disappears in 2 to 3 volleys. But we'll see if that's the case this time. Khan are not exactly the sort of faction which like to stay static, so we'll see if that's going to come to any sort of fruition, but we'll go through that when we talk about the Khandish armies. As for here, we can see the Captain Gervais's army. He's got a combination of Ironfoot pikes and Ironfoot warriors on the front line. The pikes are going to be a good move just to stop the cavalry from charging right into the front, but also the fact that Khans don't actually have any pikes of their own. They only have access to halberds, so even if Khan did decide to go for a lot of infantry, the halberds that they would be relying upon would be kept fairly comfortably at bay by the very solid Ironfoot pikes. And on the front there you can see obviously these Ironfoot warriors also have the armour upgrade, so that will also help them soak up a little bit more of the Khandish missile fire, which is another tool which they're probably going to have to try and rely on here, regardless of how they're going to choose to do this, whether it's with their mounted units or not. Arable Legionaries as well, so this is another hallmark of Arable's infantry quality. The Ironfoot units are kind of okay, they're nothing too special, but the Arable Legionaries are certainly a line infantry unit of very good quality, and they'll be able to beat pretty much anything Khan has one-to-one outside of some of the individual Brotherhood units, or of course the Nurad Storm Guard, but they are far more limited in the Khandish line, whereas the Arable Legionaries can be used more liberally by a couple of Arable armies. We've also got a couple of units of Ironfoot crossbows out here on the flank. You will almost never see Arable without any crossbows. They'll be going for a full rush if they've gone for no crossbows at all, but even in that case you could definitely make the argument that at least one unit of crossbows is still going to be good to offer a little bit of support to your rush. Couple of those crossbows on the flank. Another unit, well, we have a unit of Ironfoot axe throwers here as well. Looks like they've got an armour upgrade as well, just to keep them a little bit more solid. Of course, I've made my opinion on axe throwers very clear. They are a very useful tool, a phalanx buster through and through. Their damage can be mitigated more easily than javelin fire by shields and armour, but the higher base damage means if you pick your targets correctly, they can absolutely devastate individual units. And this is another one of Arable's very damaging skirmish units, which you can use to really good effect. So again, Arable have certainly got a lot of tools around their infantry, which allows them to deal a lot of damage before the melee fight even starts, and then their infantry, being dwarves, is also very good. And this is typified really by the Dragon Slayers of Arid Mithrin. They're probably the most fancy infantry unit that the Dwarves of Arable have. The Dragon Slayers of Arid Mithrin, of course, are armour piercing in melee, which is what sets them apart from the other two really high tier sword and board units that the Dwarves of Arable have. Really, really strong. The equivalent of the Mithril Guard from Khazad-dûm, really. Very, very difficult to beat one-to-one. There are very few units in the game which will want to go anywhere near the Dragon Slayers of Arid Mithrin, and I really like their new unit model as well. Dane is going to be rolling with them today. He's also got some Axe Guard of Arable nearby, obviously the Dwarven shock infantry units. Dwarves with axes, it's a classic combination, and in this case, of course, they're going to be able to do a lot of damage. Khand are not necessarily super heavy on their armour, but really the base damage of the Axe Guard is all that's going to be needed here to make the Dwarven infantry line even stronger. Of course, we have the Blacklock Engineers, you know, a very, very devastating unit. To be honest with you, in terms of the specialty projectile units, in my opinion, they are the most effective overall, because unlike the Witchers, who can deal damage more quickly, they are able to survive under scrutiny from other ranged units much more easily than the Witchers. The Witchers can be focused down by archers, especially high damage archers like rangers or even armor piercing ones, fairly easily. The Blacklock Engineers, as a result of being multiple HP, heavily armored and shielded, can't be dealt with like that. You know, so it's very difficult to deal with the Blacklocks. In my opinion, they really don't need multiple HP. It's a step too far. The Blacklocks in general are the thing which tips Erebor a little bit into the zone of being too easy to play, like I said. And even the Blacklocks in and of themselves don't need multiple HP to be effective. You know, I think they'll be able to survive a good amount of missile fire even without that. With it, it just means that you may as well not even bother trying to shoot them. You need to stop them by getting them into melee, which is just another thing you have to deal with when facing against Erebor. We also have the Ironfoot Hammer Guard here, another really strong facet of the Erebor army, because they are effectively the Dwarven Knights. Really, really strong against other cavalry in melee, a devastating charge. And yeah, a very difficult unit to deal with when mounted. Erebor's cavalry contingent is by no means as strong as Khan's, who they're going to be facing off against today, but 2 units of Ironfoot Hammer Guard is still the sort of thing which Khand are going to need to send significant resources out after just to kill them. And then, of course, they're going to have to deal with the rest of the Dwarven army as well. Frodo, I think he's got a relatively similar army, including Blacklock Engineers, Dragon Slayers, some Axe Guard in here as well. Arable Legionaries, yeah, it's looking very similar indeed. He's got his Ironfoot crossbows out on the side. A lot of tree cover here that both sides can use, although Khand may be able to use this to sneak their cavalry into a position where Erebor don't notice them charging, which, if that happens to Variag cataphracts and the like, could be very devastating. Frodo's army, very, very similar to Captain Gervais's. As for Khand, they are, unlike Erebor, who have bunched up and are going to be trying to defend in a new box together. Khand are going to be trying to come at them from 2 different angles, and it's going to be Rules and Kuro who are going to be trying to break down this Dwarven box, and if anyone can do it, it's going to be these 2. So Khand, obviously, as an evil men faction, they can certainly lay on the numbers, and the Nomadic Axemen are going to be a good choice here, just because, you know, cheap Axemen, AP, going to be useful for dealing damage against the Dwarves. They won't be able to make much of a dent all on their own, but at the very least they will be able to damage the Dwarves, which is something which the Nomadic Light Infantry certainly would not be able to do. They're going to be, they'd be thoroughly outmatched, but the AP here should be very useful. We have the Mighty Variag Cataphracts, which is going to be Rules as General. Obviously these knights could be the difference between Khand and Erebor here today. If they get some good charges off, Erebor's army could find itself in real trouble. And this, honestly, not the other cavalry units, but the Hwacha, could be a real saving grace here, because it will force the Dwarves to move away from their new box. It will force them to create gaps, and as soon as those gaps arrive, then the cavalry is going to need to be on hand to take advantage of those gaps that appear, because the Dwarves can't afford to just sit there in their new box and take a bunch of fire from the Hwacha, because they will take a huge amount of damage from it. The Hwacha is really very, very effective against an army which is staying static, especially one like the Dwarves, who are going to be trying to bunch up as well. We have the Nurad Windblades, who are a really strong unit of multiple HP anti-cavalry cavalry. It'll be interesting to see how they match up with the Ironfoot Hammer Guard here, because I can only imagine that was the purpose that they were brought for, because they are certainly not as powerful as some of the other Khandish cavalry charges. Speaking of which, we have the ultimate glass cannons, really, in the shape of the Brotherhood of the Lance. They really are very fragile. If any of the Dwarven crossbows get a hold of them, they will die off very, very quickly, because they are not multiple HP and they are unshielded. Their armour is okay, but it's still not going to be enough against crossbow bolts, unfortunately for them. But there's no doubting the fact that they can do a lot of damage off the charge, and they will need to here, I think, from a Khandish perspective. We also have one of my favourite units, certainly my favourite Khandish unit, the Brotherhood of the Wain. They can really cause a lot of disruption in the Dwarven lines. They don't necessarily get a ton of kills as they roll through. The crossbows will be able to plug away and get some individual kills as they move through. But the chaos that they can cause could be fairly significant. On top of this chaos that the Hwacha is causing, this should present plenty of holes for their cavalry to be used to good effect. We also have some nomadic scouts back here. Of course, this is the javelin cavalry that Khand have available to them. Again, could be very useful for getting in close, hitting and running the Dwarven lines with their armor-piercing missiles, but once again, they really are very fragile. If crossbows get a couple of volleys into them, they'll be as good as done. Then we have the Brotherhood of the Axe, obviously the better unit of axemen that Khand have. They cost about 900 florins, which gives you an idea of how strong they are, but they are only one individual unit, whereas the Dwarves are able to bring units of similar quality only to a much greater extent. So a lot of work for the Brotherhood of the Axe to do here, alongside the Narad Stormguard, who, to be fair to them, are one of the, well, they are the strongest halberdier in the game. Multiple HP, really very, very powerful indeed, but again, there's only one unit of them. And then a couple more javelins in the Nomadic Marauders. And then finally, the player who sent me the replay, of course, is Kuro Guro-chan. I think he's actually got a pretty different looking army to Rules, unlike the two Dwarves who have gone for very similar ones. He's gone for some foot archers in the form of the Nomadic Raiders. They won't be able to do a ton of damage to the Dwarves, but they will at least be able to give them something to think about. We have quite a lot of Narad footmen as well. A good choice against the Dwarves because of their AP, of course. They won't be able to match the Dwarves in terms of quality, all in all, even with the 2 units of AP Narad they have in the footmen and the halberdiers behind. But they will be able to contest the infantry fight. Khand will have to win the fight in other ways than infantry, but at the very least they won't crumble here, considering the Narad core. Once again, Nomadic Axemen, good to see. Some Variag Cataphracts, obviously the Knights, some more Narad Stormguard, a lot more Javelins in the Nomadic Marauders, Brotherhood of the Axe, Nomadic Scouts and Marauders once again, and I did see a unit over here indeed, the Brotherhood of the Spear, really strong unit of spears, actually capable of dealing quite a lot of damage. Their spears may look a little bit weird, they almost look like the sort of foam swords you got from fairs, but they should be able to do a decent job on the front line. At the very least they'll hold, and the Dwarves will have a tougher time killing them, and they could also be used to zone out the Dwarven mounted units as well, but we shall see. It's going to be interesting to see how Khand approach this, but without further ado, let's begin this battle on the Old Forest Road. And I think right from the off here the key is going to be rules, because I think this Watcher was a fantastic pick to bring against the Dwarves, because it will certainly make the Dwarves' lives a little bit less comfortable. The Watcher is going to need to get into position where it can fire, because there are a few terrain features blocking the way here as we move through the trees. But one thing that Khand can't afford to do is play into the Dwarves' hands by simply mindlessly charging their front line. They'll be held in place for too long by the upgraded Ironfoot Warriors and Ironfoot Pikes, and the Dwarves will be able to pick them apart with their crossbows, and also the quality from their infantry will be able to do the rest. And yeah, the crossbows are the main reason why you most certainly would not want to do that. Kuro is going to be moving over through the trees. I think the units actually have a speed boost when they get onto the road here, which will probably be more useful actually for the Dwarves than Khand, because obviously the Dwarves are a little bit slower, obviously with their stubby legs and their very heavy armour. Here you can see that Rules is also starting to mobilise his army, the Variag Cataphracts, the Windblades, and also the Brotherhood of the Lance, and the Chariots actually moving out to the flank. And obviously this is just to give the Dwarves something to think about. If you do noob box, it does give your opponent the opportunity to really hem you in a little bit. But the Dwarves will have been very well aware of that before the battle began. And this is most certainly their plan. Obviously it's pretty much the oldest tactic in the book when it comes to Total War, forming a nice box with your units, and obviously the Dwarves very much reward that kind of play as long as you can cover your bases. Arable in particular, purely because you have access to those crossbows which can really dig you out of a hole. Khazad-dûm a little bit different in the way that, you know, if your box isn't meticulously constructed and there are any gaps in it at all, you can really be punished quite dearly for it, even though Khazad-dûm's infantry overall is of noticeably higher quality than Arabor's. It doesn't really make up for the fact that Arable have got better supporting units in place. And it's not as if Arabor's infantry is bad either. Units like the Arable Legionaries and the Axe Guard of Arable really give Arable a nice amount of quality to their line, and the Ironfoots are really they're better than anything Human Kingdoms tend to have, outside of a very few exceptions like Numenor, of course. Nomadic Raiders moving into place, so Kuro also is going to be squeezing in from the side. Khand are doing exactly the right thing here. The Dwarves set up a very nasty looking front line, but both Khandish armies here for the most part are just going to completely ignore it and go around to the side, so this will force the Dwarves to at the very least reposition. It's easy enough for the Dwarves to just sort of shift their army over a little bit, but it will at least force the Dwarves to move. The last thing you want is to just play into the Dwarves' hands here and just allow them to sit there and kill you. Here you can see the Watcher is moving forward. The Watcher does need to be a little bit careful, because if it wants to get up onto a higher position on this hill over here, it will be putting themselves into range of the crossbows. So where Rules decides to park his artillery here is going to be pretty interesting, to say the least. Meanwhile, the Ironfoot crossbows here are actually firing now, because the Nomadic Raiders are in range, and the Nomadic Raiders are going to start trying to skirmish with the Ironfoot crossbows. This is a fight that will only end one way. The Dwarves, of course, have got superior armour and shields. But having said that, the Dwarves won't really want to be utilising their crossbows onto a very cheap unit of Nomadic Raiders, cheap relatively speaking. their very basic Eastern-styled armour and their recurve bows, but Khan will be fairly pleased with how, you know, they've managed to draw the Dwarves into a skirmish fight, and that is a problem with the Dwarves of Erebor. You don't... When it comes to long-range skirmishing, you kind of have to allow the opponent to fully dictate how that's going to go, purely because you don't have the range. You have no units of archers that you can utilise, and it is a massive deficiency that Erebor have. But for the most part, because of how tough the Dwarves are to arrow fire, Arable can just kind of sit there and take it, unless you're up against a really devastating archer line, in which case you may be shit out of luck there. Meanwhile, the Hwacha is now in position. You can see the crossbows are trying to kill off the crew, but here we go, the Hwacha is now firing away. That lovely screen shake that the Hwacha has when you are nearby to where it fires. The Ironfoot Hammer Guard are now moving forward to try and stop them, because you can see here Frodo's portion of the army is being absolutely shredded by the Hwacha here. A lot of damage being done here to the frontal phalanx, as well as some of the crossbows and legion units in behind. Rules is going to try and save his Hwacha from being crushed by the Ironfoot Hammer Guard, and he should be able to do that. You can see that the Hwacha crew is going to be able to retreat in behind the nomadic axemen here, and the Ironfoot Hammer Guard actually did take a fair amount of damage there. At least far more damage than they would want to against a very basic unit of nomadic axemen. The Hammer Guard are here, and you know the Dwarves are going to have to either use their crossbows on these nomadic axemen or just run away from them. You can see here the Hwacha is going to get back mounted, more with the nomadic axemen moving forward, and of course the beauty of having a cheap unit of axes like this is you don't really care if they do take significant damage at the hands of the Hammer Guard, because the Hwacha is going to more than recoup those losses. Over here, rather similar situation here, Erebor having the terms of the battle dictated to them as a result of their defensive posture. And as a result, both of those units of nomadic raiders actually really starting to chip away at this unit of Ironfoot crossbows, but of course there's more of that where that came from an Erebor perspective. They have their Blackhawks and another unit of Ironfoots, so this tactic will only work for so long for Kuro over on this side. Over here, the damage that Erebor are going to be taking is far more significant. And here you can see the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. It's a rather desperate ploy, I think, this from Frodo to try and kill this Hwacha off. But Rules is really not going to be worrying at all. He's got his Axemen close by, and actually now the Hammer Guard, without even charging into the Axemen, got caught by them, and that means a good amount of them are going to die off here. Melee defense is not really the strong suit of the Ironfoot Hammer Guard, so quite a lot of those axe blows will be finding their mark. Multiple HP or no, that's still a lot of AP damage to deal with, and this is where this kind of tactic can really start to bite you. You know, going fully defensive like this with Erebor is risky for this reason. Frodo is having to just sort of sit here and take it, because he can't really afford to move in, because he knows as soon as he starts to move in and try to swamp over the rather limited force Rules has here, Rules is going to come forward with his javelins, his cap both mounted and dismounted, and he's going to start charging from the rear with his really devastating units of lancers. So Frodo is at a pretty huge disadvantage here already. And this is the danger of being overly defensive, you know, to the extent of a noob box. It allows the enemy to fully dictate the terms of the battle to you, especially when it comes to Erebor, because they have no long-range options. And this is maybe the best example we've seen so far of Erebor struggling in this kind of battle, because both of the players know exactly how to deal with this sort of thing. Having said that, over here Captain Gervais is having less of an awkward time of it, but actually Captain Gervais is now sending over his own Ironfoot Hammer Guard. I would have suggested actually that this probably should have happened sooner, and he probably should have come to the aid of Frodo a little bit sooner with his Ironfoot Hammer Guard, purely because with two of those units it would have been much more difficult for the Hwacha to continue firing. The Hwacha is almost dead. Frodo has been trying to focus it down with his crossbows, and he has almost succeeded at this point. And that will be a good thing for him, but the Hwacha has already certainly more than paid for itself. You can see over here that Rules maybe caught napping a little bit, and Captain Gervais able to get a free charge off into the nomadic axemen, and that's going to be all pretty much free kills. They're not really going to be able to respond to that. And he hasn't really got any mounted units nearby either. His nomadic scouts are trying to pressurise the flank instead. Meanwhile, as you hear Rules sending his Brotherhood of the Lance forward, as Kuro starts to close in with his infantry as well, the noose is tightening. With the Brotherhood of the Lance going to be charging through the trees here. Let's see how... I mean, they are going to charge into the Axe Guard of Erebor here. They are going to dodge the stakes. Obviously, in trees like this, you have to be really aware of where your opponent has placed those stakes. Otherwise, you could end up charging right into them. As it is, though, Rules is going to continue to bully Frodo here, really. as the Axe Guard of Erebor took a huge amount of damage there from the Brotherhood of the Lance. And the Brotherhood of the Lance are a difficult unit to use purely because of how fragile they are. A lot of people don't really think too highly of them, and I'm actually among them. I feel as though the Brotherhood of the Lance are a little bit too fragile for what they offer. But as long as the enemy isn't shooting them on the approach with missile troops, they are a very deadly unit of Lancers. They will do a lot of damage. You can see there the Nomadic Axeman also spreading out. The one thing that I would say about Rules' army here is it does lack a lot of infantry strength, so he is going to have to continue playing like this for some time. All the Brotherhood of the Lance are getting a charge off into the Ironfoot crossbows. Kuro, on the other hand, with a lot more infantry, a lot more AP infantry at that, is going to be able to move forward and make an assault stick more easily. You can see here there's a lot of Nurad footmen coming in, the Brotherhood of the Spear, and this is a problem. I mean, Erebor here, a lot of their reinforcements are still on the front, and they kind of don't need to be there anymore because all of Rules' cavalry is over here. And as it is, they are going to have individual pockets here, Arable, just utterly overwhelmed. You can see there are Ironfoot warriors, there are Arable Legionaries in here as well, but I think Khand are going to be just fine in this sort of engagement here because these pikes were not quick enough in helping reinforce this area over here, and at this point now, Blacklock Engineers, like I said at the start, the best way to deal with Blacklocks is not to shoot them because of how tough they are, but to get into melee and to stop them from firing. And the Nurad footmen have managed to do just that, and all of a sudden Captain Gervais's lines are in disarray, really. Nurad Halber's defeat is a distinct possibility. I mean, this is the problem Khand have. They've played a very good game so far, but quality-wise, Erebor and the Dwarves in general are always going to have better infantry than the men of the East. And there you can see the victory still seems certain for the Dwarves. The Nomadic Marauders are going to be throwing their javelins in. Ironfoot Hammer Guard from Captain Gervais are now in behind the lines of Kuro. So he is going to have to be quick about his assault here because it's only going to take a couple of charges really from the Ironfoot Hammer Guard for all of Kuro's work here to be unravelled. Nomadic Raiders starting to rout off as well. Erebor, in spite of the fact they were caught rather off guard, they are managing to hold out so far, and support is here in the shape of the Ironfoot Hammer Guard. More Ironfoot warriors are on the way forward now. And you can see here that the problem that they kind of have is Rules is kind of unable to mount a similar sort of assault on this side. It's not the end of the world as long as Rules continues to do damage to Frodo in the way that he has so far. And there you can see that Nomadic Scouts also over here able to throw their javelins into the front of this Bracenet Ironfoot pike line for free. Here we can see the Dragon Slayers of Arad Mithrin absolutely cleaving through the first wave of the Khandish troops, but now some of the more elite troops are coming in. The Nurad Storm Guard, they will certainly be able to put up more of a fight. You can see here, even though Khand did bring the right troops for the job, the quality of the Dwarves really did shine through in that initial engagement. And Khand honestly had the right idea there. They managed to exploit a lot of gaps, but unfortunately for them, a lot of their good work seems to be going to waste here as they are being repelled by the very powerful Dwarven Infantry Corps. The Ironfoot Pikes, they did manage to get a unit of Ironfoot Pikes over here alongside those Arable Legionaries. That's going to be far too much for Khand to deal with. Kuro here, his army is starting to struggle. Having said that, there are a lot of gaps which can be exploited now. Beriag Cataphracts are over here, Nomadic Axemen also, Nomadic Scouts. Captain Gervais took a lot of damage there on his Ironfoot Hammer Guard, but there's also a lot of dead Khandish troops back here as well. Nurad Windblades from Rules 1 now, pretty much the Dwarven Cavalry is gone. So now the Khandish cavalry has free reign basically, and any gaps that they can find will be necessary there. You can see that with the Windblades pulling out there, they're lucky that the crossbows weren't actually trained on them, otherwise they would have been slaughtered and they would have run away and then taken a second volley in the back. Here comes another unit of Nomadic Axemen, but unfortunately I think Kuro is really starting to struggle. Even the Brotherhood of the Spear, some of the better Khandish troops, are having a pretty torrid time, and a large part of that is because the Dragon Slayers of Arad Mithrin are just giving Khand the business in here. A lot of the other good Dwarven troops as well. The Dwarves have not gotten away with this scot-free, they have taken damage. But I think Khand will probably be fairly disappointed with this because they definitely went about the engagement in the right way, but the quality they had at their disposal just wasn't up to standard. And the Dwarves able to do a lot of good work there. Nurad Windblades charging in, getting some good damage done on the Ironfoot crossbows. Rules has brought an army which is honestly really difficult to face. But as a direct result of that, he doesn't really have the ability to close in on the Dwarves. And Frodo, despite taking a huge amount of damage early on at the hands of the Watcher and even some javelins and some cavalry charges, he could weather this storm and ultimately come out on top, because it does look as though Captain Gervais is going to beat Kuro's infantry force pretty comfortably here. And like I said at the start, really very little wants to be tangling with the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin, and this is the reason why, kind of just being run through by them in the vanguard, really, with all of the rest of the good quality Dwarven infantry units following. However, the Dwarven cavalry did do a lot of good damage off the charge, and maybe now it's time for Khan to return the favour with a nice charge coming in there from the pride and joy of their cavalry force, the Variag Cataphracts, pulling out those nasty looking axes. The Hammer Guard is still trying to charge them down. Narad Windblades doing the business. Nomadic Marauders throwing some javelins in there. And there is a bit of disarray in and amongst the Dwarven lines here. And a few good charges could reverse Khan's fortune here. They still will have taken some pretty nasty damage. But you can see here that the crossbow line is being systematically shut down by both of the Khandish armies' sets of cavalry. Rules has also got his own Variag Cataphracts in here as well, getting a good charge there onto the Dragon Slayers of Ered Mithrin. And Frodo is having this elite unit of Dwarven infantry denied to him, at least so far. And of course there is the fact that Rules is still yet to truly commit everything. He's still got his Brotherhood of the Wain, which they could be really devastating considering how much damage he's already done against an undermanned army, causing even more damage with chariots. Meanwhile, Axe Guard of Erebor, you can see the crossbows also trying to do their thing. The Ironfoot Axe Throwers throwing their payloads as well. What are they throwing them at? That's going to be a fairly key choice. They're going to be throwing them at the Ironfoot, not the Ironfoot, the Variag Cataphracts. Well, no, they're not, because they're immediately going to get charged by Kuro's unit of Cataphracts. That's a lot of them dying off as well, so doing a good job now. And actually Kuro, with more reinforcements coming forward, the reinforcements may largely only have been Nomadic Axemen, but he's still able to put pressure here on the Dwarven lines, and perhaps all is not lost. I would still give a distinct advantage to the Dwarves in melee. Here you can see that a combination of pikes and warriors should be enough to beat a single unit of Brotherhood of the Axe, but they've actually done a really good job here, the Brotherhood of the Axe. You can see just the carpet of bodies they've left in front of them. I mean, this is pretty much their ideal environment, facing heavily armoured infantry. But the pikes should be enough to keep them at bay, to be honest with you. Nomadic Axemen getting in behind the lines, they shouldn't last too much longer, to be honest with you. Very cheap unit of axes, of course. Here you can see both units of Variag Cataphracts now running amok in and amongst the Dwarves' lines, and this is worrying because what Frodo was certainly hoping for was that Captain Gervais could have been able to deal with Kuro a little bit more efficiently than he may be able to, and that's going to leave Frodo pretty heavily undermanned when it comes to facing down Rules when he decides he's whittled his army down enough. There are the Windblades. They've taken quite a lot of damage at this point, and this could be the end of them as well because they're taking point blank fire from the axe throwers, as well as a few of them being skewered by pikes. Oof, those Blacklock Engineers still trying to do their thing, but almost getting entirely flattened there. Now the Dragon Slayers, as well as a whole cohort of Ironfoots and Arable Legionaries, are now moving back. After moving into Khandish territory, they're now going to have to secure their own centre again. Will they be able to do that? Still the unmistakable twang of crossbows firing away, the Blacklock Engineers, Nomadic Marauders moving forward. It'll be interesting to see when Rules decides that he's going to be moving in as well, because I mean I know that he doesn't really have the same ability to do that with his army. Well, there goes Rules' general, getting skewered by pikes. So he was trying to charge into the Blacklock Engineers because they were sticking out in front, but the charge carried them into the pikes waiting in behind. High risk. Kuro there charging into a section of line that did not have pikes, so this is very good awareness to sort of zoom in and make sure there are no pikes there before charging headlong into the Ironfoot warriors and doing more damage. Obviously the way that Khan are going to win this, they're going to have to continue to whittle down the Dwarven infantry if they're going to have much success. Rules has still got his Nomadic Raiders throwing their javelins into the Blacklock Engineers. Like I said, the Blacklocks, if you can get them into a good position and shoot down the lines of your enemy, that's 9 times out of 10 going to give you the win. But they're not going to be allowed to do that here, I don't think. The unmistakable horn of the evil man. And that is going to be just about enough, I think, well, it could be enough to save the Brotherhood of the Axe if they continue to charge in and out there, cycle charge this pocket of Ironfoot resistance that they have. Kuro's general appears to be stuck on some of the Ironfoots there. He is going to escape now, though, with his glaive. Meanwhile, over here, it really is a case of only pockets of resistance. Kuro and Captain Gervais have very much fought one another, mostly to a standstill. Captain Gervais probably has a couple more units of infantry left, but to have a unit of Variag Cataphracts still running around in good enough shape to continue doing damage is a big boon in the late game, even with all these stakes around. These Nurad Storm Guard trying to finish off these Arable Legionaries. They should be able to do that, or at least they would have been able to do that if the Dragon Slayers didn't return to finish the job that they started. Meanwhile, still haven't seen the chariots in action just yet. They're just sort of waiting in the background over there. They're actually using their missiles, which is good to see. Obviously, as crossbows, and individually they're crossbows that can deal extremely high amounts of damage. I think they're actually trying to go for... well, I don't know what they're trying to go for, actually. I don't think they're in range of the Dragon Slayers. But to use their ammunition before they then charge in is actually quite wise, because when they're in and amongst the enemy, they can start dying off pretty quickly. And that will, of course, take away your ability to use their pretty powerful missile attack. Nomadic Scouts continuing to try and charge through the Arable lines, actually succeeding in getting to these Ironfoot crossbows. And that could be enough to finish them off. Oof, brutal. Nomadic Scouts obviously not exactly the most high quality unit of cavalry in this situation. Here you can see a unit of Ironfoot Pikes and Ironfoot Warriors. In spite of all that damage that they took earlier on, Arable I should say, at the hands of the Huacha, they still have a front line, which is going to be enough to stand up to Rules here, because Rules didn't invest an awful lot into his infantry. He does have some Storm Guard and some Brotherhood of the Axe, which could be enough, honestly, to give them the win, but not when they're stood all the way back there, unfortunately. Frodo continuing to hold out for the time being against these probing assaults. Variag Cataphracts on the way back over. You can see now, I think Captain Gervais has decided that enough is enough. Technically, I guess, with Captain Gervais retreating, you could say Kuro almost won the battle for this side, but I think proportionally you have to say that with the amount of army he has left, probably not. But Captain Gervais is going to continue to try and, well, continue the theme of Arabor's loot boxing ways by going over to get as close to his ally as he can, and they're going to form a smaller loot box. Now the scale of the battle is getting smaller with all of these casualties, but Kuro there able to get a nice charge into the Dragon Slayers of Arab Mithrin. He's going to need to get out of there quickly before the Pikes are able to get a hold of his Cataphracts. Only one Cataphract fell in that mess, I think, but the fact that there are still quite a lot of these Pikes around is worrying. There, though, you can see the Brotherhood of the Wain are in close proximity, and they are going to be firing their crossbow bolts into this Dwarven infantry blob. And we're getting to the business end of this fight now. It's going to be decided pretty soon. You can see Rules is coming forward with yet more of his Nomadic Axemen. And late on, without too much of their army remaining, and Erebor do have a tendency to break if their morale infrastructure falls apart, those chariots running through the lines could cause a mass rout for Erebor. Now, of course, the problem that can't have is they themselves are also extremely susceptible to routing when it comes to their infantry. Units like the Nomadic Axemen are going to not enjoy being in melee with the Dragon Slayers or the Blacklock Engineers or anything like that whatsoever. But their AP will certainly help them against the more basic units like the Ironfoot Warriors here. These Nomadic Marauders are certainly not going to be enjoying life either. They're not really designed to be in melee. Still both units of Dragon Slayers intact with both generals. Intact enough that they will still be a factor here. But here, the problem I think that Frodo may very well have is that all of that damage he took early on may very well start to take its toll, because that's a lot of Nomadic Axemen that Rules is flooding forward. His infantry may not have been as high a quality overall as Kuro's, but they're going to be able to do a job here against the Ironfoots, and as if that wasn't enough, there's still these Variag Cataphracts doing the business. Whatever happens to those chariots, there they are, getting into a position to continue firing, I'd imagine. Obviously the problem the chariots have is that they really don't want to be involved in melee with any of the pikemen, because otherwise they will start to die pretty quickly. Here comes Rules' quality units as well, the Nurad Storm Guard. I think the brushing up against the pikes there unfortunately made the Brotherhood of the Wain turn around. One of the chariots there dying off. Whatever happens to those Brotherhood of the Axe, I know he's got them around here somewhere. There's a couple of Dragon Slayers, I should say. Nomadic Marauders, still those Variag Cataphracts charging in, and a unit of only 7 at this point, but Knights, even if they're extremely depleted, they can still do a lot of damage off the charge, especially when the margins are this close. That could be enough to decide the battle in favour of Khand here. Erebor may very well have taken too much damage in the early phases of this fight to keep up this kind of defence, especially with units like the Brotherhood of the Axe now arriving on the front line. They'll be able to put a real beatdown on the Ironfoot Warriors. And how exactly are Erebor going to deal with the chariots? Now you can see here the chariots piling in. The chariots, that's probably the worst part of the line they could have charged into, to be honest with you, because it's so thick with Ironfoot pikes that immediately as soon as they went in there they started to die off. But again, when you're under tree cover like this, it can be very difficult to see what you're actually charging into. And the Variag Cataphracts are almost certainly charging into pikemen as well, but they're going to be able to continue to do damage. Narad Stormguard, victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. Yeah, I think at this stage in the battle, I don't think they have anything which can match the Stormguard and the Brotherhood of the Axe together, and that's not counting the slew of nomadic axemen that are also fighting alongside them. Although, having said that, this is where morale starts to become a factor. The nomadic axemen are running for the hills, not able to keep their discipline like some of the better Khandish units. Here are the Brotherhood of the Wain. There goes one of the generals. Cleaved in twain by the Brotherhood of the Axe. Obviously the Dragon Slayer is extremely depleted by the time they got into melee with them, which is why the Brotherhood of the Axe are so dominant in this particular melee fight. Still the Variag Cataphracts running around. Ironfoot pikes. I mean, a saving grace for the Dwarves could be that they still do have pikes, but they can't just afford to noob box with these pikes they've got back here. They need to group up all of their remaining soldiers, which to be fair is not an awful lot. I think the Dwarves are going to run out of manpower ultimately here. These Ironfoot warriors trying to charge in here to stop these nomadic marauders. But unfortunately for them, as it's just Ironfoot warriors, you can see the Brotherhood of the Wain just running them over. And I think they are going to be able to carry this fight now. And you can see here this unit of Ironfoot warriors. Now the Brotherhood of the Wain able to avoid the pikes, charge right through the Ironfoot warriors and break them. And I think with units of 40 starting to rout, I think those are the margins that are going to make this impossible for the Dwarves to come back from now. There's simply too many decent Khandish troops still on the field. Mostly Ironfoot pikes left alive, which is going to take away the sting of some of these knights and chariots that are still running around, but these pikes alone are not going to be able to deal with the Stormguard and the Brotherhood of the Axe. Especially not when the Brotherhood of the Wain apparently still have some ammunition. They're going to charge in here, which is almost certainly going to be the end of the Brotherhood of the Wain, but I guess at this late stage you may as well try and break them, or get a couple of extra kills. Some nomadic axemen in here as well, a unit of 80. Don't know if they came back from routing. They probably did, considering the direction they're charging in from. And I think that is going to be just about that. Very competitive fight indeed. 10% the difference. Looked pretty dicey for a little while there from Khan. You know, Captain Gervais's army looked like it was going to hold up pretty well against Kuro's assault, but unfortunately I think the battle was ultimately won and lost on the other side. You know, well, there goes the Dwarven General, the second Dwarven General. Captured his corpse by the looks of things. You don't run someone through with an axe and have them live. But ultimately I think, well, there we go, end of the battle. I think ultimately the Dwarves lost this fight to a couple of things. I think the composition, obviously it is an RP battle, so you have to decide your composition ahead of time. And I think Khan, the Hwacha, was a fantastic pick from rules. I think it did really well. I also think the fact that Khan had two very different armies that they used very well also helped out, because it meant the Dwarves couldn't be unified in their approach. They had to sort of handle each of the two armies very differently. But also I think that one of the things which added on top of that, in addition to the composition, was the deployment. I think that the Dwarves, noob boxing like that is always going to be very tempting as the Dwarves, because they're so solid in terms of their infantry, especially for Arable, because they're able to support their lines really, really easily with their crossbows and the like. But here you saw kind of the weakest Arable can possibly be, because they had the early longer range skirmish fight largely dictated to them, and they actually got away with that more than they otherwise would have done, because they were actually quite fortunate that the terrain fell in such a way that the Hwacha had to get into range of the crossbows to actually get an effective shot off. If that wasn't the case, if the Hwacha could have remained close to where it started, the Dwarves would have been in even more trouble, because then even more Hwacha volleys would have been loosed into Unfrodo's army before rules had to move forward, and it would have been a more dominant victory from Khand, I think. As it was, they were able to deal with that, but obviously Kuro was also able to dictate things with his archers on the other side. A limited amount of damage, but still very important when you consider the margins by which this battle was won and lost. And ultimately, from that, the Dwarves kind of were able to fight their way back in the mid-game by really dealing with the Khandish infantry, as you would expect. You know, obviously the Dwarven infantry is of higher quality than the Khandish infantry, and they still had the support of all of their skirmishers. But as soon as the engagement happened, Khand did not just charge right into the front of the Dwarven line. They instead decided to move around from the sides and force them to reposition. As a result of that, there were always going to be gaps. There were always going to be gaps in the Dwarven formation, and ultimately stuff like the Variag Cataphracts and the Brotherhood of the Lance were able to take advantage of that, and those charges were always going to be the difference to whether Khan won or lost this game. The Ironfoot Hammer Guard were also dealt with very well, I think, because they can be a real thorn in the side of anyone going cavalry heavy against Erebor, because they're so surprisingly tough. Well, I say surprisingly tough, so surprisingly, well, they're really tough and they're really damaging, which perhaps shouldn't be surprising considering the kind of unit they are. But they were dealt with quite well by Khand. But let's see what did the damage for Khand overall. Unsurprising to see the Variag Cataphracts do the best, and I think the two units of Knights, both units of Knights, I would give them the MVP because they really got into the centre of the Dwarven line. And as soon as you get into the noob box and as soon as you start really mixing it around, that is always going to be a problem for them. And they were able to kind of deal with it, the Dwarves, with the pikes, but not well enough ultimately. Like, you can't let a unit of Knights get 363 kills and expect to have a comfortable time. The Brotherhood of the Axe also did very well. Like, the Brotherhood of the Axe are always going to do really well against heavily armoured factions, and in this case they were able to pick their engagements well against stuff like Ironfoots. Obviously they would have been told where to go by Dragon Slayers and the like, but you've got to pick your engagements wisely. The Storm Guard did okay, but they were shut down, I think, by the Dragon Slayers before they could really rack up a really high kill count. Cataphracts also doing a really good job over here. The Windblades, even, despite not being armed with lances, also did very well. The Brotherhood of the Lance getting over 150 kills for how fragile they are is also impressive, and of course the Brotherhood of the Wain, also those chariots. The Watcher, though, 354 kills, another really key unit because it was able to carve through Frodo's manpower so effectively. And by the time the late game came around, Rules may not have had a ton of infantry to his name, but he didn't need it because he had already picked away at Erebor's manpower. And ultimately that's the thing. If the Dwarves had set up to be a little bit more aggressive here, Rules' army could still have been effective based on how he could have used his cavalry and his chariots, but he could not have used his Watcher if Erebor were aggressive. So kind of a catch-22 here. It's one of those army compositions that you look at, and against the Dwarves of Erebor in particular, from sort of a rules perspective here, it's a pretty good army for facing Erebor, to be honest with you, because it's got everything you need. It prevents them from just sort of sitting back as they did with the Watcher without being really punished for it. But it also means that if they do charge forward, you know, you're going to have the tools to deal with that in the form of the chariots and the cavalry. You're always going to be opening yourself up to crossbows against Erebor. But that just comes with facing Erebor. And I think it says quite a lot here that Khand played pretty much an ideal game against Erebor with some really good compositions to face them. And it was still pretty close, honestly. It was still within 10%. I think the way that Khand played, there's probably deserved to be more like a 20 or 25% differential. As it was, Erebor, you know, being what they are, you know, they're always going to be able to withstand a little bit more pressure, and they're always going to be able to make an enemy pay for engaging them, regardless of how they choose to do it, because of how devastating stuff like the crossbows, the axe throwers, and of course the main event being the Blacklock Engineers can be, and then of course add into that the fact they've got really good infantry as well. It's a difficult thing to face, but Khand did it in a way that was really top-notch here, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. But yeah, like I said, sort of a shorter battle today, more by necessity because I've got a more limited time to record. But these are pretty good too. I always like the RP battles, and it's good to see Erebor. Well, it's good to see, you know, the way I talk, you'd think that I hate Erebor, but I don't really. It's just that I feel as though Erebor are quite easy to play, and generally speaking, whenever I see a replay, Erebor always tend to do well because of this. But I feel as though it's good to see them on the losing end of things for once, just to show that I do not think they're overpowered, to be honest with you. The closest argument I would have to that would be the Blacklocks, where I think, you know, they are a bit more of a spanner in the works. I think, you know, losing their 2 hit points would probably be enough, I think, to bring them more into line. It would still leave Erebor being pretty strong, to be honest with you, but I think that would be fine. My issue with Erebor more is the fact that they're so easy to play. Like, you know, you don't get punished as much when you're playing as Erebor versus a lot of other factions. But I mean, it's a nice problem to have. You know, the fact that the faction that I'm sort of most critical of isn't necessarily unbalanced. It's just, you know, personal preference, I suppose. But yeah, very nice from Khand. Nice to see an RP battle as well. So next, I think we'll be going for another one of the new maps. Like I said, I've got quite a lot of battles that I've seen recently. My next sort of bigger recording session, which will probably be closer to the weekend, I'll probably try and do the Witch King's Sanctum. Again, that's probably the map which is most likely to persist with the crashing issue, so it'll be interesting to see if it does. And moving forward, I'm not sure what other battles I'm going to do. I've got a siege for Osgiliath, which is good. We haven't seen Osgiliath in the new patch yet, at least not from me. There's there's a few options I have, but regardless, I think the next battle will once again be making a return to a sort of larger scale siege, I think. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.